session. Our very first session will be from the science team on the subject of economics and the cost of polarization. I'd like to introduce Ms. Minnerva Zhou, who will make the presentation on behalf of the science team. Go ahead, Minnerva.
Thank you, Your Honor. Hello, everyone. My name is Minnerva Zhou, and I will be presenting on the cost of polarization. To start out, I would like to begin by exploring the cost of political polarization, specifically through some examples you may be familiar with. My first example of political polarization is with COVID-19. Since the beginning of the pandemic, in February of 2020 for the United States, there's been roughly a 9.2% rise in unemployment. These unemployment rates are lower among workers with higher levels of education. Furthermore, there have also been losses in business revenues, particularly with small businesses, with the amount varying between states and with different COVID-19 policies. Interestingly enough, a study found that economic policies during COVID-19 were more driven by political party identification as opposed to local health conditions. Specifically, Democratic areas saw more disease suppression restrictions on business and social distancing rather than with Republican areas. Some of you might be aware of my next example. My next example of political polarization is with the 2018 government shutdown. As the longest US government shutdown thus far, this shutdown was the result of polarization between opposing parties in Congress and in the presidency. As a result of the shutdown, federal workers were delayed roughly $9 billion in compensation, and the GDP decreased by roughly 0.2% in the first quarter of 2019. In addition, the 2018 government shutdown also affected roughly $329 billion in total discretionary funding for 2019. This is roughly 25% of the US government's total discretionary funding each year. Taking a look at this graph here, we notice that trends in political polarization in Congress here on the left have a possible correlation with income inequality, as well as throughout the years from 1944 to 2016. So in addition to political polarization, let us also take a look at the cost of racial polarization. One key example of racial polarization is with residential segregation. Residential segregation is the geological separation of different groups in different residencies. Historically, this is often the result of redlining, which is the systematic isolation of populations, often Black populations, through intentionally lower levels of investment and discriminatory housing policies. One study found that these racially polarized neighborhoods often led to income disparities among races, particularly with minorities. In turn, these income disparities would then result in further racially polarized neighborhoods. So the relationship between income disparities and polarized neighborhoods becomes what somewhat looks like a feedback loop here. So this graph here shows the median household income broken down by race over the last few years. The different colored lines are different racial groups. Let's specifically take a look at these two lines over here. Let this red line represent the income difference around 1975 between those that are white and those that are Black. Now, if we put this same red line over here in more recent years, we can see that there's a gap indicating a larger median income disparity over time. Taking these examples into account, a mandatory or voluntary solution that would address the costs of polarization would need to consider a few things. Number one, how polarization affects GDP, individual income, total discretionary funding, and economic policies. It should also consider the circular relationship between racial polarization in areas such as housing and employment, and the income disparity between different races. So, as a recap, political and racial polarization affected the determining of COVID-19 economic policies and restrictions, increased income inequalities between racially polarized neighborhoods, which is widening the income gap, particularly with minorities, and decreased the US gross domestic product, which is the GDP, and total discretionary funding of the United States government. Thus ends my presentation. Thank you.
We will often have questions from the pro and con legal teams at this point, but because this particular presentation and the next one are believed to have general applicability in all areas, we will not have separate questioning from the pro and con legal team. But at this time, we will ask Mr. Sun Thrillingham to give a statement on behalf of the pro legal team.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, it will be costly to implement a mandatory service program. But the first thing we need to ask ourselves is, as Minnerva has talked about, what is the cost of polarization? On the racial front, we have seen how as the United States becomes increasingly polarized, it has a corrosive effect on increasing wealth inequality among different races, which in turn creates a feedback loop. But let's go to somewhere much more recent. When you think about COVID-19, COVID-19 was something that blindsided everybody, and it needed a cohesive response at a federal, state, and a local level in order to overcome. We can look at countries like Taiwan that did that. And the United States, even though it has now finally adjusted towards life under COVID, its disharmonious response due to different states being under different political control, had different types of responses, led to the entire country lagging behind in terms of COVID recovery. We can extend this to even issues like climate change. Whether people argue about the reality of climate change, the impact of climate change is real. Whether it's hurricanes on coastal states to fires in California, everybody is affected by it. And if people remain polarized on the issues, the inaction of governments in order to do something to prevent these events from escalating can impact everybody. So when we put this into context, in addition to government shutdowns, the 2018-2019 shutdown that cost the US GDP about $11 billion, we think that having a program, even though it may seem costly, that explicitly aims to deal with reducing polarization at every level, from political to racial to geographical, we think it's valuable. And because of its impacts on each person's life, if you are in Minnesota, a politician at a federal level from Florida has an equal say in terms of how you will be affected by federal policy. So we think that getting citizens together and reducing their polarization and increasing their common identity of being an American is vital in order to deal with this increasingly expensive costs of polarization. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Madeline Stinkowitz will give a statement on behalf of the con legal team.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, as Minnerva so eloquently put, polarization is deeply entrenched within American society, and it's not only affecting people mentally, which Mr. Dowdell will talk about later, but also costing us as a population quite a lot through the government shutdown, COVID-19, etc. Thus, a program must be put into place that is both cost-effective as well as easy to implement. We must ask ourselves, are we willing to wait 30, 40, 50 years to live in a society where these government shutdowns do not occur and cost the population so much money? Thus, our voluntary program would not only be able to be easily implemented within American society, but also would cost Americans less than the mandatory program, as it is incorporating private companies as well as government programs, thus cutting down on costs a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we will have a presentation from the science team on the subject of polarization effects on public health. Mr. Philip Dowdell will come on screen and deliver that presentation. Thank you.